Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you this week, we cover everything from the increase in severe COVID-19 cases in the UK, the rate of vaccinations and purported claims that they cause cancer, the impacts of long COVID, particularly as they relate to changes in muscle structure. Your gut microbiome might be more resilient to things like, antibiotics than you would expect. The sex differences in the brain between males and females. Europe is currently voting on the role that GMOs would have to play in agriculture. What wiped out the largest apes that ever existed? Neri Oxman is ironically accused of plagiarism when her husband is actively pursuing others for the same thing. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the rather predictable, but somewhat understated if not stated at all, reality of severe COVID-19 cases surge in the UK over summer. Now, summer might be the ironic time for this to happen, as you would expect there to be a drastic increase over winter. But the reason behind this is that the vast majority of people who are currently sick with severe COVID-19 were eligible for vaccines but did not use them. The key to the findings that lead to this is twofold. One is that it is based on health service data, so there's a certain amount of, salt and skepticism that must be taken with this claim, largely owing to the fact that they're taking existing data and applying it as a model, and then saying this is what happens. In and of itself, it's fine, but just be aware of that. The second is slightly more important, and that is the COVID-19 vaccines at present are less effective, particularly since Omicron became prevalent, which has then been overtaken by other variants since. It means the vaccines are less effective. But the key is, they are effective enough at preventing extreme cases of infection. This means either death or hospitalization, and that's the key of this study. They're not saying that the vaccine would stop infection, necessarily, or that it would prevent all deaths and so on, only that it would drastically reduce the number due to reducing the severity of infection. In news that does show why vaccines do work for other diseases and why they're so important, we have children's hospitals inundated with measles cases. Measles, a disease that was practically eradicated in the UK, is seeing a resurgence. Now, the resurgence is not just down to the fact that vaccines are not being given to kids the way they should be. It's a combination of, to be blunt about this, immigration related to children who haven't been vaccinated as kids coming to the UK, carrying it and spreading it to some extent. It's rather harsh, but it is what it is. It's one reason why normally the immigration process involves administration of the vaccines that are needed, but it doesn't always happen, and as such, the measles has been on the rise in the UK. Understand, for the most part, the UK would be lucky to see a handful of children needing to be hospitalized for measles in a given year. There have been more than 50 in the past year. That's more than a tenfold increase. That tenfold increase, as mentioned, is down to a combination of idiots not vaccinating their children, and unfortunately, an increase in the number of children who have measles and bringing it in. But it's not just children, adults too for that matter. A lot of people coming from parts of the Middle East, visiting family and so on, tend to come back and they carry it. As a result, they also provide another entry for measles into the UK. The other challenge is that once you get the disease brought in and it begins to establish its own little colony, unfortunately it spreads because it's incredibly contagious. Measles doesn't take much to infect someone, and as such, we now have the issue of increasing rates that haven't been this high since the 90s. Just to be clear for those who aren't particularly familiar, the 90s is when dial-up internet, that is 52 kilobytes a second, was common. That's how long ago this was. Of course, the UK is not the only country experiencing its own spate of stupidity and various issues to with communicable diseases. The UK, honestly, is just as bad as the US, and arguably the US is actually worse. And unfortunately, the FDA has now had to admit that pretty much everything in the country is at a tipping point due to the loss of herd immunity in many places. This follows a commentary written by the FDA Commissioner, Robert Califf, and it basically says that COVID-19, influenza, and RSV are all at tipping points. One of the major claims within this is one that's been spoken about for a while now, and that is, the better off you are, that is, the more affluent and higher income, the more complacent you become, and unless you give a crap about whether or not vaccines exist, particularly in the USA, because you can pay for hospitalization, unlike the others who would likely have to sell a kidney if not go bankrupt to pay for their kids' hospitalization. And that's the issue here. The affluent tend to be the ones, sort of, who are most likely to exhibit behaviors that ignore vaccines. They are also the assholes who tended to have benefited from being vaccinated as children and then deprive their own children of exactly the same. And next we have another study, but it's only tangentially related to vaccines. And that's simply because anti-vaxxers and conspiracy theorists have been claiming that this is proof that the COVID-19 vaccine causes cancer. Now, unless the COVID-19 vaccine has the ability to time travel, that is not the case. The shortened version of what the study did was look at published data for cancer rates between 1995 and 2020. Understand, it's between these two time frames, so unless cancer is not just time traveling, but the time traveling is also related to COVID-19 vaccines, it didn't have any relationship, because they only became available in 2021, a whole year later than they were looking at. That means that any of the data and results that derive from that data have no bearing on the COVID-19 vaccines. None at all. Yet, somehow or other, conspiracy theory idiots and anti-vaxxers have tried to make the relationship. Anyway, the results itself are kind of helpful. It tells us a lot, part of which is simply that people are increasingly surviving from cancer, which is good, although the idea of survival is, to a certain extent, basically have they lived at least 5 years after being diagnosed, not necessarily surviving in the longer term, although no one survives in the long term. The other thing here is which cancers have increased and which have decreased. The most commonly increased cancer is colorectal cancer, that is cancer of the arse, and possibly that it is. Conspiracy theories and anti-vaxxers have this because, well, they are just full of shit and they're all assholes. Salt aside, there have been a decrease in things like respiratory cancers, largely due to a decrease in tobacco use, except in the younger cohorts where it's slightly increased, which does match with the existing knowledge of an increased use of or consumption of tobacco in younger individuals. In terms of other smoked products, we have cannabis and the effects it has on things like running and other exercise activities. There has been speculative arguments made that cannabis consumption will improve your performance in physical activities. As a result, it is banned by a range of sporting regulatory bodies and it is tested for. As a result, the actual data for this is kinda limited. Now, we need to be very clear about this. The study is not just very isolated, but it is very small in nature. As a result, what they've found is, let's say, interesting, but not necessarily something that could ever be translated to the rest of society based on the size of the study. First of all, it was based out of Boulder, Colorado, and, unsurprisingly, the University of Colorado Boulder. The study itself is in an area where cannabis consumption for recreational reasons is allowed. They took 42 healthy adult runners who self-identified as regular cannabis users. They threw them on a treadmill for about 30 minutes, at a moderate pace. They found from this that they believe that cannabis makes exercise more enjoyable, which is hard to believe. Exercises are never enjoyable. You are literally burning off your own body in order to go nowhere in this case. It's a treadmill. You literally stay in the same place. Nonetheless, they seem to have found that yes, if you consume the cannabis-rich products, it seems to make the run more enjoyable. There is a big issue with this work though, and it's that whether it was THC, which is the actual high product in cannabis, or it was CBD, which shouldn't be causing a high, it seemed to result in some degree of enjoyment in the activities. As a result, it's not clear whether or not it's the perception of being happy and therefore enjoying the run, or if people are actually enjoying the run, given that what is effectively a controlled treatment found not necessarily as strong a result, but nonetheless strong enough results to possibly indicate that these findings are not as substantial as indicated. Or everybody involved could have been high and nobody actually knows what happened, and they're just making it up as they go and laughing about it. In other, let's call it exercise-related news, although this time purely dedicated to muscle structure, its implications of long COVID on changes to muscle structure, which is something of a worry. Long COVID is already known to be affecting the brain and particularly the neuroanatomy, various things to do with the heart and lungs, and so on. Heck, even some of the sperm production, that is, the various parts of the testes that are involved in making sperm, appear to exhibit some changes. So seeing something in the muscle structure, while unexpected, isn't exactly surprising. Understand, much like the cannabis and exercise study, this study is relatively small, but at least there is an understandable reason why this study is small by comparison. That is, they relied on muscle biopsies and blood plasma samples. As a general rule, both of these are much harder to get than they are volunteers to throw on a treadmill and smoke cannabis. The 25 individuals with long COVID and 21 who just had COVID but not long COVID were analysed this way. The other noteworthy feature is that the average age was 41, so we are talking effectively middle age, which does have some implications for the way the body behaves at that time. It's a roughly equal split between men and women, so there aren't many concerns in that respect. Although, arguably, you could make a case that they'd have been better off choosing one sex or the other to analyse, and increasing the numbers associated therewith. The first findings are, well, rather obvious and not that surprising given that we know long COVID affects the lungs. The findings were, unsurprisingly, that there was a worse uptake of oxygen in those who had long COVID. What is slightly more interesting is that there was lower muscular strength. The analysis under a microscope found that the individuals who had long COVID tended to have a much higher proportion of fast-twitch glycolytic muscle fibers. These are the fibers that are intended for high intensity but very short bursts of activity. Because of this, they fatigue much more quickly. And that would explain why it is that the individuals have a poorer muscular strength, because their body is simply not able to maintain that degree of activity for as long. They can put out a lot more power for a brief time, but then they stop putting out power. This was then further supported by analysis of the blood plasma, which found that there was a range of products missing from the blood plasma needed for glycolysis. Glycolysis is used by the mitochondria to provide energy for the further reaction and therefore actions of the muscle cells involved. Further to everything we've mentioned so far, there was also evidence of immunological activity at the muscle sites of the biopsy. Now, to be clear about it, this evidence is not as strong. They found an increase in macrophages and T cells around the tissue samples that were taken. The concern with this is that those cells are all involved with inflammation, and as a result, inflammation interferes not only with the ability of mitochondria to work, therefore lower power for the muscle cells, but also that just generally, inflammation, if there's no actual problem to fix, is a bad thing. And this may explain some of the effects of mitochondria, and therefore the consequences of long COVID are mitochondrial dysfunction and lower muscle function. However, and because this is a biopsy sample, That may just be a consequence of you literally poking a needle in someone and taking a chunk of their muscle. If, as noted, the research is actually what they found, it could be an indicator that, yeah, this is actually a worrying trend. There is another feature to this, but it's a feature that's important not because necessarily it relates to long COVID itself. Rather, they found these results in both long COVID and normal COVID patients, and these are microclots. For all of the stupid claims by anti-vaxxers that the COVID-19 vaccine causes blood clots, they really ignored the implications for those who have COVID-19. And this is the key here. They found it both in long COVID and normal COVID patients' microclots, which don't appear to be having implications for circulation of the blood once it gets out of the capillary. However, it would indicate a pathway and mechanism by which blood clots could be caused in those who have COVID, and, not due to vaccines. Further news about diseases, we have, fungal infections doubling deaths worldwide. That alarming headline aside, it's not actually as necessarily bad as it might seem at first glance. The reason for that is that these are estimates. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's one of these studies where they're looking at what's available in terms of data and trying to extrapolate out. The work itself says that, if you have all the people who die from fungal diseases, it's about 2 million people a year, and that was 11 years ago. This time now, it's about 3.8 million. The key there being that these are effectively estimates. The estimates aren't necessarily made incorrectly, but how they get them is important. What they did was take the proportion of fungal diagnoses that are made and then treated, and an estimate as to those that are missed and obviously not treated. Because of this, they've taken their rate of known diagnoses and theoretical misdiagnoses, applied it to the current rate of actual diagnoses due to improved diagnostics and so on, and still assumed the same rate of missed cases. Yeah. That's effectively saying that even though we've improved our ability to identify everything, we still assume that the same number of cases are missed, or the same ratio of cases are missed. No, that's not how that works. While, at least in terms of the preliminary research, we have a bunch of criticisms, some of the later information and discussion within this publication from the conversation is actually interesting and useful, more useful. And most notable for us are two aspects. The first is the idea of a double whammy, as they put it. That is, influenza or some other respiratory disease, such as COVID-19 and aspergillus. This would cause a drastic increase in the number of people dying, and especially in hospital. So, for example, if you were hospitalised due to influenza or COVID-19, you're at a much higher risk of infection with aspergillus, and therefore dying. The other is black fungus, which, none surprisingly, is, a black fungus. As a result, there is concerns, in the same way there is with aspergillus, that this would have a similar degree of complication due to COVID-19. In terms of microbiology, at least your body is theoretically better equipped, let's say, not your body, but the bacteria within it, to deal with the antibiotics that you would need to be treated for all these things, assuming that it's a bacterium and not a virus. Because antivirals work for viruses, antibiotics work for microbes and particularly bacteria. The two aren't at all going to work for the other. This is where antibiotic resistance is surprising in our GI tract. In theory, the microbes within our GI tract are exhibiting a much greater degree of, let's call it, resilience compared to any other bacteria that are out there. And this is important as it gives them a huge advantage over pathogenic bacteria. For example, causes of food poisoning. In theory, this is all well and good. It means that you're less likely to experience illness due to something like bad food or anything else. However, there is a massive caveat to that benefit. And it's not even a caveat, it's almost comparable to a double-edged sword. On one hand, it will cut against the pathogenic bacteria. However, it can cut you just as badly when the same commensurate bacteria, that is bacteria that live within your GI tract, themselves turn pathogenic due to an opportunity presented to them. The very short version of this is that due to an increased use of antibiotics, both antibiotic-resistant bacteria from outside the body and the use of antibiotics within the body have led to your own microbes increasingly develop antibiotic resistance and therefore being more, let's say, resilient to the possibly pathogenic bacteria from outside your body. And next we have the simple question, what happens when you quit caffeine? And the answer should be very straightforward. Sadness happens when you quit caffeine. Presumably the researchers involved wanted a somewhat more detailed response than just sadness. Whether you consume coffee, tea, Coca-Cola, Red Bull, or anything else that's caffeinated, your body does undergo a response to it, largely having to do with the increased alertness from the effects that caffeine has on the body. Further to the effects on the brain, making you more alert, it does actually get into just about every other organ and tissue in your body, owing to the fact that it is both water and lipid soluble, meaning it can move through the membranes and cells, but also freely move within the water-based cellular fluid. The article from the conversation goes through the range of effects that caffeine consumption and later caffeine withdrawal has on your body, whether it is brain function, cardiovascular health, happiness, toilet behaviors, and more. Although the toilet one is weird, as it's, strictly speaking, not caffeine that causes you to need to go poop. Rather, it seems to be the coffee itself, as decaffeinated coffee as well as caffeinated coffee both have the same effect. Nonetheless, the answer to their question is sadness. The sadness happens when you stop taking caffeine, along with a complete loss of any productivity and any ability to function in society. And next we have a article from Quillette, and Quillette is a newer entry into the marketplace of ideas, and while interesting, it doesn't necessarily always present everything in the most balanced manner, so take the information within the article at least somewhat more skeptically than some other sources, although arguably other sources at the moment are getting just as bad and biased. The article is Sex Differences in the Brain and the Mind. Something that really isn't that surprising. The sex differences have been known for a very long time. In fact, it's one of the theories behind sexual dysmorphia. That is, those who transition from being male to female or female to male because their brain structurally is different. This would be a fundamental argument as to why it is a medical reason to transition, rather than being based in psychology or psychiatry. Nonetheless, the brain itself is structurally different, and that's a key here. There are significant differences in the networking of neurons within the brain and the regions within the brain. This means that men and women do, on average, have differences in their ability to use certain skill sets or cognitive abilities in different ways. Now, for example, spatial ability and reasoning, episodic memory, socializing, and so on. And again, to an extent, this does make sense, not only from an evolutionary point of view, but to another extent simply from a developmental point of view. If you have a bunch of guys out hunting down massive beasts, they're probably more worried about how they get to home after they killed it, how they kill it, and so on. Whereas if you have a number of women at the base camp or cave who forage in the local area and work together all the time, they probably need to be able to cooperate in those terms as they're constantly together. This is not translated so well to the modern world where the same considerations don't necessarily exist, but the structural differences remain. This is where the Quillette article is useful. It goes through a range of evidence for and against the case that's just been made, and the implications this has, for example, in trying to push women into STEM, and how you could more effectively get women in STEM rather than just trying to squish them like a square peg through a round hole. And next we have a pair of articles. one from Science-Based Medicine, and one from the American Council on Science and Health. They both focus on exactly the same topic, that being the American Academy of Pediatrics article that took aim at glyphosate, and that was full of misinformation and, to be less delicate about it, bullshit. It made up or selectively reported on nonsense, largely ignoring the either better stated studies, the more current research, or selectively chose to use one study over another to only be able to support their argument, despite there being arguably superior research out there. This is where, unfortunately, they've really hurt themselves. Understand, it wasn't just a published article by researchers. There was a, let's call it, educational tool provided titled "Are GMOs Safe for My Child? AAP Policy Explained," which had all of exactly the same problems as the literature published, except that it was simplified for parents, and unfortunately, because it was based on the bullshit research used very generously, it basically had no real benefit. We've effectively gone through this before, and we've eviscerated that article because it has all the same problems that most of the other biased and bullshit research done in preparation for lawsuits has. That is, poorly designed, poorly studied, and poorly described, and often very selectively reporting on. But Science-Based Medicine and the American Council on Science and Health both go through the research itself in decent detail, so if you'd like to read through them, they are available in the links below. Next we have further agricultural news, and it's the vote for GMOs in Europe, and the European Parliament is looking to be a very close run as to whether or not it turns out that the European Union will allow GMOs to be used more freely than they are now. What is interesting, at least from a political point of view, is the split. It's not just a split in terms of who's supporting it, but who is and is not supporting it in the same political wing. For the most part, the right side of the political spectrum is very much pro-GMO, and it kind of makes sense, at least in Europe. The left is far more divisive in whether or not they want to allow, let's be clear about this, more permissive, but certainly by no means as broadly permissive as other countries' rules for genetically modified foods. Yeah. For some strange reason, the left in Europe does not want, or at least part of the left in Europe, does not want GMOs. The split on the left is not just based on the fact that they're GMOs, but not only are they arguing at the moment over definitions of what is and isn't a GMO, whether or not you can patent the GMO, and a bunch of other regulatory hurdles. And that's the issue here. The left is basically going, we want everything solved now and completely, whereas the rest of the left and the right are going, look, we want GMOs out there and we want them in place. It's something of a, they've got a valid point, but it's a valid point that doesn't necessarily need to be resolved now. Next we have further news in, well, agriculture and genetically modified organisms, and in this case, most likely plants. It's, well, the fact that organic farmers in Europe are effectively shifting over to the idea that they need to embrace GMOs, which is kind of funny. For years, they've been claiming that, oh no, we can get by with heirloom varieties of this, that, and the other, that we don't use any pesticides, that we don't use herbicides, that everything we do is safe and better for you. And now suddenly, after they realize they can't compete on a level market with conventionally grown crops, they're going to start using genetically modified food to make up for their often at least 20% inferior production rate. Yeah. This is what happens when you start on the premise of having a worse product line. It costs you more and you get less to make it. And now you want to make up for that difference by bringing in GMOs. Something that conventional farming has long since wanted to do and just can't due to the nature of, well, in this case, European Union government. This is where the effectively interview actually goes through a surprisingly balanced and nuanced understanding of what's happening. It's a conversation with someone named Just van Kasteren. They are an organic farmer, but what they note is that their organic farmer recognizing that it does carry with it its own problems and limitations. As such, organic farming, in their words, wouldn't be able to meet global food needs. It will be a niche. But it's a niche that in order to be able to sustain itself needs to move with the times. Well, certainly getting with the times more than organic's current approach that's basically on par with medieval peasants. Shifting to other news that's with the times, bird flu has started killing polar bears. Yeah, this is not good news. Unfortunately, polar bears are doing several things, one of which they are moving further south. This is simply a result of the need for them to have at least access to some food and other comforts. Things that are possible simply owing to the fact that, well, a warmer environment with the animals they feed on, or plants. Unfortunately, that also exposes them to other species that they don't necessarily otherwise have regular access to or exposure to. This includes birds that are carrying bird flu or H5N1 influenza. The key here is not necessarily that the polar bear itself has been infected. Well, it is, but it's not that one polar bear that's a concern. It's the fact that it's a new species being added to the ever-growing list of species that are susceptible to infection. We've already seen things like foxes, otters, minks, sea lions, and seals all be infected, and now polar bears for this newest variant of avian influenza. The concern, apart from the fact that it's a dead polar bear and polar bears need to be protected because they're giant and fluffy, is that the fact that it's mutating enough to be able to infect a new species, and it's arguably likely that that infection occurred via consumption of a dead bird, a bird that died from avian influenza. If that's the case, then it's not as much of a worry. It simply means that the polar bear consumed so many dead animals that had died from influenza that it simply overwhelmed the immune system. It sucks, but that's actually okay. The concern is rather, what if it's an infection due to exposure from a far less significant mechanism, that being something like they only consumed a single bird rather than dozens. This means that it's adapted, the virus has adapted, to infect mammals and, in this case, a polar bear. Shifting to less terrifying news, we have a somewhat seemingly random, but somewhat entertaining study. It's the idea that if you paint your cow with black and white stripes, it won't be attacked by flies so often. This is not just so you can make a knockoff zebra for your really, really cheap zoo, but actually for a reason, and it is somewhat derived from zebras. The theory was, can the researchers show that the black and white stripes on zebras were effectively an evolutionary adaptation to try and reduce the number of flies that would bite them? The Japanese researchers took 6 black cows and gave them either a black and white stripe or simply left them be, and waited to see whether or not it would exhibit a fly-repelling behavior. The research itself finds that, yeah, it actually works surprisingly well. And then they go on to try and make arguments about how it would help with issues like pesticide use. Now, there is a counterpoint to be made, and that is that this is a benefit of having black and white stripes, but it's not necessarily a reason that why the black and white stripes were formed in the first place. Rather, as we've mentioned in the past, the Alan Turing model showing a reaction and counter-reaction in 2 different sets of cells might explain why these bands exist in zebras. It doesn't mean you can't use the not intended but beneficial byproduct of that phenomena in this way. It just means that they are attributing a phenomena to zebras and then applying it to cows without actually having the correct reason for it to occur. In other animal news, we have a question about what wiped out the largest apes to ever roam Earth, and we're not talking about the Potsdam giants. The giant ape, called Gigantopithicus blacki, would have weighed somewhere around 300 kilograms, which is huge. Unfortunately, despite weighing what could be easily 3 humans, if not more, they're long since dead. And unlike other giant animals, we're not entirely sure about why, but there could be some explanations. The answer they've reached is fairly straightforward, thankfully. That is a shift from a very lush, effectively rainforest or forest type condition with lots of canopy cover, lots of water, fruit and food sources, and effectively a protected scenario, to what is effectively open prairie land prone to fire. So think of the shift from a gorilla in a forest or rainforest to trying to live out on the savannah. It just doesn't work. And next we have what frankly sounds like it should belong in Demolition Man. It's an article that does have some questions related to it, about a woman who went up to a police robot in Los Angeles wanting to report a crime, or what they perceived to be a crime, and instead effectively got told to step out of the way and then had a song played for it, which is arguably just as useful as the fines issued in Demolition Man. The reason for this article to exist is owing to the fact that the robots, as they wander around in their trial phase, haven't actually had all of their functions activated yet. This includes the alert button. Yeah, the big button that people are meant to push to call for help doesn't work. Oh, the irony. Technology's all well and good, but yeah, there are some questions about its implementation. Implementation of technology is actually going to lead to the next article, and it's owing to the increasing number of senior academics who are being put under the spotlight for plagiarism. Some of them rightly so, some of them as collateral damage. In this case, Neri Oxman is sort of in the latter. The reason Neri Oxman is currently in trouble is that her partner has been pushing for the president of Harvard to be blunt about it, get in trouble and arguably be punished for plagiarizing a surprising part of their theses, or one of their theses anyway. Because they're the partner of the person pushing for this, their work has also now been analysed for plagiarism, and theoretically has been found to have multiple paragraphs plagiarized. That is, the content of that paragraph has been taken from someone else's work without attribution. Now, attribution, depending on what it is they've done, it could just be a citation at the end. You basically summarize the person's work and you put your citation there. In other instances, it may need quotation marks. Without that, you don't know that it is literally, word for word, their work. The reason for this, and for that matter other individuals being put under the spotlight for plagiarism, is the increasing ability of technology and largely machine learning algorithms like ChatGPT to be able to more effectively pick up whether or not someone has plagiarized. Shifting to news that's both more and less disappointing, we have a conspiracy theory about the Pentagon and Taylor Swift. Yeah. The whole thing is pretty much based on the collaboration between Taylor Swift and a group called Vote.org. They are trying to encourage younger people to register to vote, which is a perfectly legitimate thing. Arguably, depending on where you live in the world, it's either a civic duty or a civic responsibility. Your responsibility you should be doing, but you don't have to, like a parent who goes off to buy milk and cigarettes and never returns, or a civic duty, where if you don't do it, you get penalized. The problem here is that, people have been attributing the collaboration as a government psyop by the Pentagon, and not just a simple civic partnership, which would be the simpler and arguably more honest explanation of what's happening. The last bit of news we have for you is purely astronomical and is interesting simply because of what it is and what it might mean in terms of the next major probe to go out into the solar system. In the outer solar system, it is possible, and the outer solar system being beyond Pluto, that a planet the same size as Mars exists. Now, to be very clear about this, the entire let's say, idea is based on theory. So we're not talking about actual hard data. The theory posits that there could be 1.2 planets with a mass greater than Mars, 2.7 that are effectively comparable to Mars, and 5.2 that are closer to Mercury. The usefulness of this is that it means that there are theoretically somewhere up to about 8 possible planets, and there is a certain range of bigger or smaller and more or less planets beyond Pluto. The key to these planets, though, is that they're not actually from our solar system as such. Rather, they are planets generated by other stars much further out. Those effectively free-floating planets have found their way into the periphery of our solar system, where they become caught up. Another option is that they're actually Eldari craft worlds, and if we try and land there, we're likely to piss off all of the pointy-eared space aliens. Take your pick as to which you prefer. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.